So in the last video, we talked about complex numbers and what they are. Just remember it includes all the real numbers and it includes all the imaginary numbers. All complex numbers can be written in a form called a plus bi form, where a and b are real numbers. Now you might be confused on that, but the I is the imaginary part, okay? All right, so I'll give you some examples of complex numbers. You could have something like -5 plus 2i. That would be a complex number. -5 is a real number. 2 is a real number. Now, when we talk about it, we're saying this is the real part, and this 2i, that's the imaginary part. Okay? So in a plus bi form, there's a real part and there's an imaginary part. So not all numbers have the imaginary part and not all numbers have the real part, but that's the a plus bi form. Okay? All right. So another example. You could have the square root of 2i. That is an imaginary number, right? Okay. So here's b. That's a real number. And what is a? Well, in this case, a is 0 because there's no real part shown. You could write it as 0 plus the square root of 2i. And then it would be in a plus bi form. Technically, a lot of times they don't use the 0, but sometimes there are cases when they want to see what a is. But I think for our book, they're just going to write the number as the square root of 2i. Okay, so when you have here's another one, 5i. That just has the imaginary part. This is called a pure imaginary number because there's no real part. That probably won't come up too often, but so that you know they call it that when the real part is 0. So when we have the square root of 2i, that was also a pure imaginary number. Then this is what throws students sometimes. 8 is a complex number. You're saying, no, it's just an 8. It's a friendly number. It's an integer, But it's a real number, 8 is. It just doesn't have an imaginary part. You could write 8 plus 0i if you wanted to see it in the a plus bi form where we have, the a and the b listed. Normally we just write 8, right? But remember, it is a complex number. It's part of that set of numbers, okay? So when we work with these, you're going to say, hey, it's not a complex number because it doesn't have an I. But remember, all real numbers are also complex numbers, okay? Now, most of the time when we're working with complex numbers, they want us to write it in a plus bi form. Now, you might be saying, okay, am I going to have to always put that 0i for the real numbers? No, they don't usually do that. If it's 0, if a or b are 0, they don't usually write it. But you could. Okay. So let's look at an example. We have the square root of -8 plus the square root of -32. There's one thing I didn't mention, and I want to mention it before I forget again. These are only for square roots. That we use the I, okay? So when we're using that I, it's not for like a cubed root, or that wouldn't make sense, but like a fourth root or something, no. It's only for square roots. So you'll notice in all our examples here in this section, you're not going to have an index that's higher than 2. They're always going to be square roots if we're going to use I, okay? So I just want to point that out. All right, when I come across a problem like this, and they usually want me to simplify it some way, and here it says to add them, I always take care of the negative first. So I would make it the square root of 8i plus the square root of 32i. I would write them that way first. Then I'm going to simplify the radical part. Now that the radical part is real, I can simplify it. So 8 is 4 times 2. So I'm going to have 2 times the square root of 2i. plus, and then 32 is 16 times 2. So I'm going to have 4 times the square root of 2i. Now, look at these parts. You have the same radical, and you also have that they're both i's, right? So you can combine those. You have 2 square root 2i and plus 4 square root 2i. You're going to have a total of 6 square root 2i. And you would write it that way, okay? So if you're having trouble seeing that, you could think about this part being 2 plus 4 times the square root of 2i, like factoring that out, the square root of 2i. And then the 2 plus 4 is 6, and that's how you get this 6 times the square root of 2i. Now this part here, that is a real number. You could put that in the calculator and get a decimal approximation. The I, though, makes the whole thing an imaginary number. And you might be saying, is that a pure imaginary number? Yeah. Okay, so that's that.